They shut off my bedroom light from the app. Just like that, with no knock on the door, no good night or "Are you still reading?" Only the sudden absence of brightness and the startled reflection of my own face in the black glass of the window. A faint hum of the smart bulb dying mid-sentence, as my book lay open on my lap, a chapter and a half from the end. They told me it was easier this way. Less forgetfulness, less waste. As if at 81 I had lost not only my memory but also the right to decide whether a night should last a little longer for me than for them. My daughter said it in that careful tone she uses when she's speaking to me as though I were a child with an unpredictable temper, the tone that pretends to be patient, but is really the closing of a door you will not be allowed to open again. I live in the in-law unit at the back of her house, the one they built after selling mine. The house where she grew up, where every scratch on the floor and faded patch of paint was a record of some ordinary day that used to belong to me. They told me I'd be more comfortable here, closer to family, able to age in place, but what they meant was that I would be in a place where they could monitor me, where my habits could be smoothed down like wrinkles in a tablecloth until I fit the shape of their convenience. The in-law unit has one bedroom, one bathroom, and a small living space that looks out onto the strip of lawn between me and the main house. A lawn that is perfect in a way grass should never be, shorn to a uniform inch, every blade the same obedient. Green, watered by an underground system I never see but hear sometimes at dawn. A low whisper like something plotting beneath the earth. From my window, I can see the kitchen lights of their home glowing in the early evenings. Not the warm amber of the bulbs I grew up with, but a cool white that makes everything look as if it's been disinfected. They are proud of this house, of its angles and surfaces, and the way it can be run from their phones, as if life were a game of levers and buttons that rewarded you for reducing every action to a tap on a screen. When I moved in, they insisted on installing the same system in my unit. Smart lights, smart thermostat, smart lock, smart camera above my door. "So we can help if you forget anything," they said. But I knew even then that the help would be one way. That the line between assistance and control is invisible until you trip over it in the dark. At first I told myself it was harmless, a sign of care, something younger people did because they couldn't imagine life without devices interceding in every moment. I let them put the app on my own phone, though I rarely used it, and I agreed to let them link my account to theirs, so that if anything went wrong they could fix it without bothering me. But nothing was wrong. Not until that night when I was reading in bed and the room blinked into darkness at the exact minute they thought I should be asleep. I remember sitting very still for a few moments, the book heavy in my lap, my eyes adjusting to the thin wash of moonlight across the carpet, thinking perhaps there had been a power cut. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, the old one I'd had for decades, only to find the plug empty, the outlet stripped bare because they had replaced it with a smart bulb in the ceiling fixture, one I could no longer control with my own hands. My phone buzzed with a message. "Lights off, Mom. Sleep well." I typed back quickly, before my courage dissolved, that I had been reading, that I wasn't ready for sleep, but there was no reply. I could hear the muffled sound of their television through the wall, the main house relaxed and awake, its lights blazing. I got out of bed, found the small flashlight I keep in the drawer, and sat back down to finish my chapter, the narrow beam cutting a cone of stubborn light through the dark. It felt absurd and dignified at the same time, like a soldier holding a candle in a bunker, knowing that the point wasn't the brightness, but the choice. In the morning, I mentioned it at breakfast, trying to make it sound like a misunderstanding, but my daughter only laughed, not unkindly, but with that slight air of dismissal she uses when she's decided a subject is closed. "Mom, you need your rest," she said, pouring almond milk into her coffee. "You don't even know what time it is half the time." I wanted to tell her that I knew exactly what time it was, that I knew it down to the minute, because I had been watching. The clock ticked towards midnight, savoring the quiet, enjoying a rare evening where the book in my hands felt more alive than my own breath. but the words stayed behind my teeth. My son-in-law looked up from his tablet just long enough to add, "It's just energy management. We're on a program now. Lights out at 11 in all zones. Saves money." He didn't seem to think that the zone in question was also a human being. I nodded, as I always do when I can't think of anything that won't start a fight I'll lose. That day, I kept noticing the light switches in my unit, how they were no longer switches at all but flat panels with tiny glowing icons, more symbols than tools, connected to something far away. I realized that I had to ask permission, in effect, to live the way I wanted, and that permission could be revoked without notice. It made me remember my mother's kitchen in the 1950s, the pull-chain light over the sink, the small defiance she took in leaving it on while she smoked her last cigarette before bed, even when the rest of the house was dark. We never had much, but what we had was ours to control. Now here I was, decades later, in a room where even the light did not belong to me, in a life that could be dimmed or brightened at someone else's whim. It would be easy to say that it was just a light, that I was overreacting, but anyone who has lived long enough knows that the smallest trespasses are practice runs for larger ones, that the erosion of dignity begins with a single grain of sand. That night, as I brushed my teeth under the steady white glare of the bathroom bulb, I imagined the invisible signal that could snap it off at any second, and I understood something I'd been trying not to see since I moved here. They were not building a safety net around me, they were building a cage, and cages, even the ones lined with family photos and scented candles, are still cages. They started with the light, but the light was only the beginning, a small crack that revealed a deeper fracture beneath the surface of what I thought was family. It was the day they quietly moved all the smart devices in my unit under their control without telling me, shifting the power from my hands into the invisible grid of their apps and passwords. I was told it was for my safety, that by linking everything to their account, they could monitor the temperature, turn off the lights, and even check who came and went, all from their phones while I stayed comfortably in my little home. But comfort was the word they used to mask control, and I felt the weight of it like a shadow lengthening over my every step. One evening, after dinner, I was sitting in my favorite chair by the window, the light warm and soft around me, when the bedroom lights suddenly blinked off. I thought it was a power glitch until my phone buzzed with a terse message from my daughter. "Lights off. Time to sleep." I was stunned, not just because of the message, but because of what it meant, that my own rhythm, my own bodily sense of day and night, was no longer mine to keep. I replied that I was still awake, still reading, but there was no answer, only silence on the other end. That night, as the darkness settled over the room, it felt less like rest, and more like being locked out of a place I once called home. The thermostat dipped a few degrees too low, and I pulled my shawl tighter, but when I asked why the heat was suddenly off, I was told it was energy saving, and that I should get used to it. I understood then that this was not about warmth or light, but about diminishing my presence, erasing my comfort bit by bit until I was nothing more than an idea on a screen, a profile to be managed, an inconvenience to be scheduled. The smart camera outside my door was shifted slightly one afternoon, so it no longer faced the garden path where I liked to sit, but instead pointed at my front steps, as if keeping me under surveillance. When I asked about it, they said it was to ensure your security, but security felt like a cage, and I realized I was living in a house that watched me like a stranger, not a mother or grandmother. I found myself walking the halls more often, unsure if I was being watched or left alone, wondering if the hum of technology was companion or jailer. One morning, I reached for the coffee pot, only to find it unplugged, and my daughter told me she had replaced it with a new machine that only she could operate from her phone, so I don't have to worry if you forget to turn it off. It was the first time I felt truly erased, replaced by convenience, and I realized that they no longer needed me to do anything but exist quietly, passively, efficiently. The books on my shelf gathered dust because the lights were out before I could open them. The quilt I kept folded on my bed, the one I made by hand, was left untouched because the warmth was controlled by an app I did not have access to. I was present but not seen, alive but not engaged, a ghost in my own life. One afternoon, I was trying to join my weekly book club over Zoom, a small comfort that connected me to friends scattered across the country. The Wi-Fi cut out suddenly, the screen froze, and my voice disappeared into silence. I knocked on the back door, hoping to find someone who could help, but my daughter opened it with a sigh and said, "We're streaming a movie. Don't knock unless it's urgent." I stood there, the laptop in my hands, my heart heavy with the knowledge that my access to the world was being limited for reasons I was not allowed to question. Later that night, I sat in the dark with a small flashlight, the beam shaking slightly in my hands, as I wondered what it meant to lose control of not just my home but my own life. When I unplugged the router quietly from the utility closet in the hallway, I felt a brief surge of power, a reclaiming of territory that had been slipping away for too long. The whole house went dark, the screens in their living room flickering to black, and I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning brought a storm of accusations veiled as concern. My daughter pounded on my door, voice raised, telling me I had disrupted their evening, that the children were upset because the movie stopped midway. Her anger was not about the router, but about the fact that I had defied their control, shattered the illusion of harmony in their perfectly managed home. Her husband whispered about considering assisted living, about how perhaps I was no longer able to live independently, and the weight of those words crushed me more than the cold that sometimes crept into my apartment. I understood then that my struggle was not just against technology or control, but against a narrative that sought to erase my agency, that saw my independence as a problem to be solved, rather than a right to be respected. They were not afraid for me. They were afraid of me, of the fact that I might choose to step outside the role they had assigned me. That evening, as I packed a small bag with the few things I could not imagine leaving behind, a quilt, a worn photograph album, a teacup my mother gave me, I felt a mixture of fear and fierce determination. I was leaving not because I was weak, but because I was reclaiming a part of myself that had been silenced. I placed a note on the kitchen counter before I left, a simple message for them to find. I am not your feature to manage. I am not your child. I am not an app. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the streetlights flickered softly above me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the unsteady but powerful pulse of freedom beneath my feet. I didn't look back. The future was uncertain, but it was mine to write. They shut off my bedroom light from the app, but that was only the beginning of a slow, creeping erasure of my presence in the house I once called home. After the first time the lights went dark without warning, and the thermostat dipped to a chill I hadn't chosen, I started noticing the little changes that felt less like mistakes and more like quiet withdrawals of respect. It was as if the house was slowly folding around me, shrinking the space where I could exist with dignity and control. The smart devices, which had been sold as conveniences, became tools of invisibility, ways to push me toward silence and compliance without ever saying it aloud. I found myself retreating into smaller routines, walking shorter paths, not because my body ached more, but because the emotional weight was heavier than I could bear. In the mornings, I would wake to a coldness that had settled in overnight, the heating schedule no longer synchronized with my needs, but with the preferences of my daughter and son-in-law, who controlled the app from their bedrooms in the main house. The heat would flicker on only when they were home, turning off as soon as they left, leaving my unit to chill as if I were a guest, not the occupant. I wrapped myself in shawls and quilts, learned to live in layers, but the cold was not just physical, it was a creeping sense of being edged out, made small. I began to notice the way my footsteps echoed differently in the hall, the silence where laughter used to be, the way my voice was answered with clipped tones or polite nods when I spoke up. The garden path where I once sat with my morning coffee was edged with smart sensors that tracked movement, and I caught myself wondering if I was being watched, judged for taking too long to walk, for pausing to breathe. The television in my living room was replaced by a streaming device that required passwords I no longer remembered, and I found myself unable to watch the shows I loved, the ones that connected me to the world beyond these walls. My books gathered dust because the lighting would be turned off before I had a chance to open their covers, and when I tried to read with a flashlight, I could see the shadows in my daughter's eyes when she came to check on me, a mixture of pity and impatience that stung worse than any harsh word. Even the small comforts I had clung to, the quilt on the chair, the teacup I drank from each morning, seemed to fade under the glare of the new order that reigned here, one where convenience trumped care, and control disguised itself as love. I remember the first time I noticed the package gone from my doorstep, a small box of herbal teas I had ordered for my nerves, the one thing that helped me sleep on restless nights. I went outside, calling softly, hoping to find it misplaced or delivered to a neighbor by mistake, but it was nowhere to be found. When I mentioned it to my daughter, she said casually, "Maybe someone took it. Packages get stolen sometimes." There was no apology, no offer to replace it, just a shrug that made me feel smaller than the missing box itself. It was one of those moments when the weight of exclusion settles on your chest. A quiet, unspoken message that you are not to expect much more, that your needs are trivial at best. The smart camera above my door became another source of unease. One afternoon, I noticed it had been adjusted. The lens pointed not toward the street but directly at my porch, tracking my movements with clinical precision. When I asked my daughter why, she said it was to keep me safe, but I felt instead that I was under scrutiny, as if my very presence was suspicious. I began to feel the eyes of the house on me, a constant awareness that my every step, every pause, was being recorded, reviewed, controlled. It was a strange and lonely feeling, to live in a home that watched you as though you were a visitor, not a part of its fabric. The thermostat control became another battleground. The temperature would drop without warning in the early morning hours, and I learned to keep a blanket by the door to the bedroom, wrapping myself tightly against the cold that no longer felt accidental. When I asked about it, I was told it was programmed to conserve energy, that the settings were fixed for efficiency, not for comfort. I was reminded that my needs were secondary to the household's overall plan, a cog in the machinery rather than a person with agency. There were no gentle conversations or invitations to adjust the schedule. Instead, I was expected to adapt silently, to bend to the new rhythm imposed from elsewhere. Even the small rituals that once brought me peace were interrupted. The tea kettle, a ceramic pot I had brought with me, was unplugged and replaced with a modern electric one controlled by an app I was not allowed to use. The coffee maker, too, was replaced, its buttons disabled in favor of remote start from the main house. I watched as my world was transformed into one where my hands had no role, where even the making of a cup of tea became an event I was excluded from. I felt the slow erasure of my presence in the home, as if my fingers were fading into the fabric of the chairs and walls, my voice lost in the hum of machines. The days began to blend into one another, marked not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the schedules set on phones I was not allowed to touch. Meals were prepared in the main kitchen and brought to me on trays, labeled and timed for convenience. But lacking the warmth of food made with love, I ate quietly, feeling the distance grow between me and the family who lived just a few steps away but seemed a world apart. The silence between us was thick, filled with things left unsaid, the heavy air of avoidance that settled after a small war fought in the shadows. The neighbors sometimes glanced my way as I walked the narrow path between the houses, but their smiles were polite and quick, the kind of acknowledgement that doesn't invite connection. I found myself shrinking, taking smaller steps, trying not to disturb the delicate balance of appearances. The smart home was a fortress of glass and light, a monument to control and perfection, and I was the one left outside, watching as my life was rearranged without my consent. The app had become a remote control for my existence, turning me from a participant into an observer, a passenger on a journey I did not choose. At night, I would sit by the window, watching the lights in the main house glow with the rhythm of lives lived on schedules and apps, a dance of efficiency and precision that left no room for mess or spontaneity. I thought of the days when the house was mine, when the floors creaked under the weight of laughter and footsteps, when I could keep the curtains open long after sunset, letting the world spill in on its own terms. Now the curtains were automated, closing at dusk like clockwork, and I was left to watch from behind a screen, a spectator to a life I had once made but could no longer hold. The smart home promised safety, convenience, and peace of mind, but for me, it was a slowly tightening noose, a reminder that my body and mind were seen as liabilities. My independence, a problem to be managed. Each small act of control was wrapped in the language of care, a kindness that disguised the erasure beneath. I was a woman reduced to settings and permissions, a life measured in kilowatt hours and screen time, a presence that could be turned on and off with a swipe. The first escalation was quiet, almost imperceptible, but its effects were profound, turning a home into a cage and leaving me to wonder how much more of myself I was willing to lose before I fought back. One afternoon, as the pale autumn light filtered through the curtains, I sat quietly in my small living room, the faint hum of the smart thermostat filling the silence around me. The digital numbers flickered, adjusting to the programmed schedule set by my daughter and son-in-law, never quite in sync with my own rhythms. I had spent so many evenings feeling like a ghost in my own home, a silent passenger on a journey charted by others. That day, however, something inside me shifted, a quiet but resolute spark that began to crack the carefully constructed shell of compliance I had wrapped myself in. It was not a grand rebellion, no sudden outburst or shouted demand, but a subtle awakening, a first step toward reclaiming the small fragments of autonomy that had been slipping through my fingers like sand. I had been struggling for weeks with the unpredictability of the smart home, the way the devices controlled my environment without my consent, turning warmth and light into commodities doled out at someone else's discretion. The lights shutting off without warning, the thermostat dropping to a cold I could not escape, the camera that watched my every move. These were not accidents or glitches, but the steady erosion of my place in this house, this family, and my own life. Yet that afternoon, as I sat with a book in my lap and the familiar ache of loneliness pressing against my ribs, I found a strange comfort in the stillness that surrounded me. It was the calm before a storm I did not yet understand I was about to unleash. The Wi-Fi had become the last tether to the outside world, my lifeline to friends and memories through the small screen of my laptop. I had arranged to join a weekly book club, a lifeline of connection that kept my mind alive and my spirit buoyed. But the week before, during a crucial discussion, the connection had suddenly dropped, leaving me stranded in silence, my voice unheard and my presence erased once more. When I knocked on the back door that evening, seeking help, or perhaps simply a moment of recognition, my daughter answered with a tired sigh and a curt instruction not to disturb unless it was urgent. The coldness in her eyes mirrored the chill that had settled in my apartment, and I realized that I was no longer a cherished guest in this home, but a problem to be managed. That evening, after they had gone to bed and the house settled into a silence punctuated only by the soft ticking of the clock, I slipped quietly into the hallway and found the utility closet where the router was hidden. The blinking lights on the device flickered steadily, a beacon of the control they held over my life. With trembling hands but a steady heart, I unplugged it, severing the digital umbilical cord that connected me to their network of surveillance and authority. The house fell into darkness and silence, the smart devices ceasing their constant communication. It was a small act, almost invisible, but for me, it was a declaration, a reclaiming of the power that had been quietly taken from me. The next morning, the ripple effects were immediate and tangible. The television in the main house blinked off during a family movie night. The streaming halted mid-scene, causing confusion and frustration. My daughter appeared at my door, anger and disbelief mixing in her eyes as she accused me of sabotaging their evening. "Did you touch the router?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. I looked at her calmly and said, "I thought it was past their bedtime." The simplicity of my words seemed to unsettle her more than any argument I could have made. Her husband muttered about considering a care facility, about how I was no longer capable of managing my independence. Their concern was less about my well-being and more about their loss of control, and I felt the weight of their judgment settle over me like a shroud. But in that confrontation, I found clarity. I understood that this struggle was not about technology or convenience, but about my right to exist on my own terms, to make choices about my life and body without being infantilized or erased. The night I unplugged the router was the night I began to reclaim my agency, not with loud declarations, but with quiet acts of resistance that reminded me of the woman I had been, and still was beneath the layers of imposed obedience. I realized that freedom was not a gift to be granted, but a right to be taken, often in small, courageous steps. That day, I made a decision to prepare for a new chapter, one where I would no longer accept the slow diminishment of my dignity. I began gathering the few possessions that mattered most. A quilt my mother had sewn, photographs of moments I wanted to remember, the old teacup I drank from each morning, and I started researching apartments in the neighborhood, places where I might live without the shadow of an app turning my life on and off. The thought of moving was daunting, a journey into the unknown, but the prospect of staying in a place where I was controlled was far worse. As the weeks passed, I found solace in small routines that reminded me of my strength and history. I walked slowly through the neighborhood, feeling the crunch of leaves underfoot and the crisp autumn air filling my lungs. I visited the local library and sat among bookshelves, letting the scent of old paper and quiet learning soothe the ache inside me. Each step, each page turned, was a stitch in the new fabric of my life, one woven with threads of resilience and hope. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the stars blink on one by one, I realized that the quiet rebellion I had begun was not just about defying a smart home or a controlling family. It was about remembering who I was beneath the layers of age and invisibility. It was about reclaiming the right to live fully, to choose when to read, when to rest, when to light a candle instead of waiting for an app to grant me permission to see. It was about breaking the cycle of silence and invisibility that had threatened to swallow me whole. This moment marked the midpoint in my journey, a turning point where the fear and resignation began to give way to courage and clarity. It was the first step toward a life rebuilt on my own terms, a life where I was not a feature to be managed, but a woman reclaiming her place in the world, one quiet act at a time. The days following my quiet act of rebellion, the moment I unplugged the router and took back a small piece of control, were filled with a tension I had never anticipated, a weight that settled over my shoulders like an invisible cloak I could neither shrug off nor hide beneath. The house, once a place of routine and quiet loneliness, became a stage for a drama I was reluctantly cast in, a role that neither I nor my family seemed to understand how to play with grace or kindness. It was during these days that the second escalation began to unfold, not with sudden outbursts or overt cruelty, but with a steady pressure that tested the limits of my resolve and clarity. My daughter's anger was the first sign of the shift. The day after the router went dark, she came to my door with a storm cloud gathering in her eyes, her voice sharp and brittle as she accused me of disrupting their lives. "Did you touch the router?" she demanded, the words hanging between us like a challenge. I answered simply, "Yes. I thought it was past their bedtime." Her disbelief was palpable, as if the act of defiance was a betrayal not only of family expectations, but of some unspoken agreement that I was to remain passive, invisible, and compliant. The frustration in her tone was tinged with fear. Fear that the neat order they had constructed would unravel, that their carefully managed lives would be disturbed by a grandmother who refused to be silenced. Her husband, who had been more distant until then, joined the confrontation with hushed comments about considering a care facility, a place where I would be looked after by professionals and kept safe from the burdens of autonomy. Their concern was less about my well-being and more about their loss of control, a realization that struck me with a harsh clarity. They were not afraid for me. They were afraid of me. The fact that I might choose a path outside their narrative, that I might reclaim my life on terms they could neither dictate nor contain. This fear translated into pressure, subtle but unrelenting, a series of comments and gestures designed to wear me down and convince me that my resistance was futile. The following days were a gauntlet of passive-aggressive remarks and calculated omissions. Meals that had once been brought to me with a smile were now delivered silently, left at the door without a word. Invitations to family gatherings dwindled until they ceased altogether, replaced by whispered conversations in the kitchen that stopped when I entered the room. The smart devices I had tried to reclaim control over were reset remotely. Their settings returned to defaults that ignored my comfort and needs. The thermostat was programmed to a temperature that left me shivering in the mornings, and the lights were turned off earlier each evening, as if darkness could erase me entirely. One afternoon, I received a letter from my grandson, the only family member who had not yet distanced himself. His handwriting was familiar, the loops and curves carrying the warmth of a boy who once sat on my lap and listened to my stories. The letter was short, filled with concern and a quiet plea for connection. He asked where I was, if I was safe, if I missed them. I held the letter in my hands, feeling the weight of his words and the distance that had grown between us. I did not respond immediately. It was not out of anger, but a need to hold space for myself, to process the fractures that had formed in the family I once thought unbreakable. The arrival of this letter was soon followed by a visit from my daughter, an attempt at reconciliation veiled in exhaustion and vulnerability. She came to the cafe where I had started working, standing stiffly by the pastry display, her expression unreadable. She did not come inside but lingered just outside the glass, watching me as if trying to bridge a gulf that words could not cross. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and tentative, asking if we could talk privately. I nodded, guiding her to a quiet booth at the back where the noise of clattering dishes and chattering customers faded into the background. Her words were a mixture of apology and justification. She spoke of panic, of the chaos that had ensued when she realized I was gone, of the children's confusion and fear. She admitted that they had thought I was behind them on the plane, that she had expected me to follow, to stay within the orbit of their carefully arranged lives. There was a moment when she looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and said, "I wasn't trying to replace you. I just didn't want your shadow in every room." It was the closest she had come to honesty, a glimpse of the fear that had driven her actions, a fear of being overshadowed, of the weight of history and obligation that she felt pressing down on her shoulders. I listened quietly, feeling the fragile thread of connection stretch and strain between us. I told her I was not a shadow, that I was my own person, and that I had finally remembered how to be one. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, filled with the things we could not say and the wounds we could not heal with words alone. She left without finishing her coffee, her departure a quiet surrender to the chasm that had opened between us. Meanwhile, the family's efforts to reclaim control took on more formal shapes. I was visited by a man in a suit, a representative of my son-in-law's legal team, who spoke in measured tones about my well-being, my assets, and the need to ensure I was in a safe environment. His presence was an intrusion, a reminder that the battle was not only emotional but legal, a contest for power played out in letters and documents rather than words and embraces. I listened to his proposals with a calm I did not feel, refusing to be drawn into negotiations that treated me as a liability rather than a person. I told him that I was of sound mind, living safely, and not under duress, that I had retained local legal counsel and would consider any further attempts at contact under the guise of concern to be harassment. In the quiet moments that followed these confrontations, I found solace in the friendships I was building outside the family circle. Arthur, a widower who frequented the cafe where I worked, became a companion in the small rituals of daily life. We spoke of birds and books, of memories and the passage of time, finding comfort in shared silences and gentle conversations that did not demand explanations or apologies. Joyce, my landlord and friend, offered a steady presence, her gruff kindness a balm for the wounds left by family fractures. As the pressure from my family mounted, so did my resolve to live on my own terms. I wrote letters, not of anger, but of closure, setting boundaries that had long been ignored. To my daughter, I sent a brief message acknowledging the past without apology, affirming my decision not to return and wishing her well in her own life. To my grandson, I wrote with warmth and hope, inviting him to visit when he was ready, free of expectations and conditions. These letters were acts of reclaiming, of defining my own narrative in a story that had tried to write me out. The second escalation was a test, a crucible of endurance and clarity that forced me to confront not only the pain of loss, but the power of choice. It was in this period of pressure and challenge that I found the strength to refuse the roles imposed upon me, to be the forgotten, the controlled, the silenced, and to step into a new life forged in resilience and quiet defiance. The path ahead was uncertain, marked by the shadows of broken ties and the light of emerging connections, but it was mine to walk, and for the first time in many years, I felt the stirrings of hope beneath the weight of what had been lost. The moment I decided to no longer be a shadow in someone else's carefully constructed life was not marked by fanfare or dramatic declarations, but by a quiet, resolute act that forever changed the course of my days. After months of silent erosion, subtle control, and the slow dismantling of my autonomy, I reached a point where the weight of their expectations and the sting of their exclusions could no longer be borne with quiet resignation. The house I had lived in, the family I had nurtured and loved, had become a place where I was managed, monitored, and marginalized, a woman reduced to a collection of settings on a screen rather than a person with a will of her own. That night, I made the choice to reclaim my dignity and declare my independence in a way that could not be undone or ignored. I began by gathering the few possessions that still held meaning for me. The quilt my mother had sewn, the old recipe box filled with cards written in the careful script of decades past, photographs of moments when laughter filled rooms rather than silence. These items were not merely objects, but symbols of a life lived on my own terms, memories of a time when I was not invisible but essential. With deliberate care, I packed them into a small suitcase, each fold and placement a reaffirmation of the woman I still was, beneath the layers of imposed obedience. Before leaving, I took one final step that felt both symbolic and deeply personal. I went to the bedroom where the smart light still hung, the device that had first been switched off without my consent, the first in a series of controls that had shrunk my world. I carefully unscrewed the bulb, disconnecting it from the app that had controlled my nights and dictated my rest. Holding the simple, warm glass in my hand, I felt a surge of power, a reclaiming of light, literally and metaphorically. This bulb, this small piece of technology, had been a symbol of the larger cage I had been placed in. Removing it was a statement that I would no longer be controlled by unseen forces, that I was choosing my own brightness. I placed the bulb in my suitcase alongside the quilt and photographs, packed the last of my things, and walked out the door without looking back. The cool night air was crisp and filled with the scent of falling leaves and distant rain, the world outside vast and unbounded compared to the shrinking spaces I had inhabited. I did not have a plan beyond the small apartment I had rented above a bookstore, a place where the walls were old and worn, but where I could live without the constant surveillance of apps and whispered concerns. The journey was daunting, filled with uncertainty and moments of doubt, but with each step, I felt the heavy chains of control loosening. The note I left on the kitchen counter was simple and direct. I am not your feature to manage. I am not your child. I am not an app. It was a message not only to my family but to myself, a declaration of boundaries and the beginning of a new chapter. I did not expect immediate understanding or forgiveness. I knew that this act might sever ties or deepen wounds, but I also understood that healing could not begin without honesty and distance. The note was an invitation for reflection, a challenge to see me as I was, not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. Settling into the apartment, I found myself surrounded by books and quiet streets, the hum of the city a soothing backdrop to my slow rebuilding. The absence of smart devices was a relief. No more lights turning off unexpectedly, no thermostats programmed without my consent, no cameras watching my every move. I began to reclaim the small joys that had been overshadowed, the feel of a book's pages beneath my fingers, the warmth of a teacup held between my hands, the sound of rain against the window. Each day was a step toward wholeness, a restoration of a self long buried beneath expectations and control. The legal letters that followed were met with calm resolve. I refused to be drawn into battles over property or custody of my own life. My reply to the lawyer was clear and firm, a boundary that would not be crossed. I am of sound mind, living safely and voluntarily. Any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment. It was a final cut, a severing of the ties that had bound me not with love but with control disguised as care. This letter was not an act of anger but of self-respect, a claim to agency that no one could revoke. In the weeks that followed, I found unexpected support in the connections I forged outside the family circle. Arthur, the widower who frequented the cafe where I worked mornings, became a quiet companion, his presence a reminder that life could hold gentleness and understanding. Joyce, my landlord, offered a steady hand and a warm kitchen where laughter was not measured and stories were shared without judgment. These relationships were small acts of grace, stitches in the fabric of a life being rewoven with care and courage. The turning point, the climax of this journey, was not a single moment but a series of choices made with quiet determination. Choosing to leave was choosing to live, to reclaim the narrative that had been rewritten without my consent. Choosing to disconnect the light bulb was choosing to illuminate my own path. Choosing to write boundaries was choosing to honor myself. In these acts, I found power not in confrontation, but in the reclaiming of my own story. As I sit now by the window of my new home, the light from a simple lamp casting a soft glow on the worn pages of a book, I am reminded that dignity is not given. It is taken, claimed in moments both large and small. The house I left behind will always hold memories, but this place, this quiet corner of the world, is where I am learning to live again, fully and freely, on my own terms. The light I hold is no longer controlled by an app or another's fears. It is mine, steady and warm, a beacon of the woman I have always been and the life I am choosing to build. The quiet that settled into my new life was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. Peace, perhaps, or the slow unfolding of a self that had been buried beneath years of silence and compromise. In the small apartment above the bookstore, surrounded by the scent of old paper and the soft murmur of passing footsteps on the street below, I found a rhythm that belonged to me alone. It was a life stripped of control by others, reclaimed in the subtle acts of daily living, brewing a cup of tea without waiting for permission, opening a book under a lamp I turned on myself, watching the evening sky shift from blue to indigo through the cracked window. This was not a grand return to the world, but a gentle re-entry, a slow healing that unfolded with patience and grace. The phone, once a conduit of tension and obligation, rested quietly in the bottom drawer of my nightstand, wrapped in a clean handkerchief as if it were a fragile relic. I did not need to check it constantly, nor did I await the calls or messages that might carry guilt or demands. The absence of its buzzing was a balm, a space where I could breathe without interruption. Occasionally I would take it out, turn it on briefly to see if there were messages, but more often I chose silence, allowing the quiet to fill the spaces where noise had once dominated. It was not loneliness, but freedom. A freedom I had forgotten was possible. One afternoon, a neighbor from down the hall, a woman with gentle eyes and a sturdy presence, knocked on my door, carrying a homemade pie wrapped in a checked cloth. She smiled warmly, saying, "I thought you might like this. It's apple and cinnamon, just like my grandmother used to make." We talked quietly over tea, sharing stories of lives lived with both hardship and joy. In her presence, I felt seen, not as a shadow or a problem to be managed, but as a woman with a story and a place in this small community. These connections, simple and unassuming, wove a new tapestry of belonging that was not forced or conditional, but offered freely and accepted gratefully. The days were marked by small rituals: a morning walk to the corner cafe where I worked part-time, the familiar rhythm of pouring coffee and wiping counters, the gentle teasing of the barista who called me the steady heart of the place. I found joy in these moments, in the tangible tasks that connected me to the world beyond my walls, in the friendships that grew slowly like wildflowers in a forgotten garden. Arthur, the widower who frequented the cafe, became a steady presence, his quiet company a comfort rather than a requirement. We spoke of birds and books, of memories held lightly and hopes cautiously nurtured. In these exchanges, I found a sense of ease, a soft belonging that needed no explanations or apologies. Occasionally, letters arrived from my grandson, the one family connection that had remained tender and unbroken despite the fractures. His words carried the warmth of shared history and the tentative hope of reconnection. When he came to visit, we did not rush into old roles or expectations, but sat together in quiet understanding, sharing moments that were neither burdened by the past nor weighted with the future. He told me of his life, his dreams, the small struggles of growing into a man with a past and a future intertwined. I listened, offering support and love without conditions, knowing that this connection was a gift we both cherished in our own way. The legal battles and letters from my family's representatives became distant echoes, reminders of a chapter that had closed with firm boundaries and clear words. I held on to my letter to the lawyer, a declaration of my autonomy and peace, a shield against further attempts to control or manipulate. I no longer needed to fight those battles daily. My strength came from within, from the quiet confidence that I was living on my own terms. The house I had left behind was no longer a prison, but a memory, a place where a different story had been written without my consent. I carried no anger but a steady resolve to honor myself and the life I was building. On nights when the rain tapped softly against the window pane, I would sit by the light of a small lamp, a cup of tea warming my hands, and write letters, not to those who had turned away but to myself, words of encouragement, reminders of resilience, affirmations of worth. I tucked these letters into the pages of my old recipe box, alongside the cards and photographs that had journeyed with me. They were tokens of the woman I was becoming, a woman who waited no longer for rescue, but held the key to her own freedom. I wrote, "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back." The community around me grew slowly, not through grand gestures but through shared meals, quiet conversations, and the steady presence of those who saw me for who I was. potlucks at the local church basement, where laughter bubbled over mismatched dishes and folding chairs, trivia nights with questions from a past era, gentle debates about politics and books that reminded me of the richness of connection beyond family ties. These moments stitched together a new fabric of life, one woven with threads of choice, respect, and belonging. As seasons turned and the days shortened, I found myself sitting on the porch with Joyce, wrapped in thick sweaters and sipping lukewarm tea. The world outside shifted with the rhythm of time, and so did I. We spoke little but understood much, our silences comfortable and full. She once said, "You know they're going to show up, right?" I nodded quietly, knowing that the past had a way of finding you even when you turned your back. But the difference was that now, I was no longer waiting for their arrival to define my existence. I had built a life not out of what was lost, but out of what remained, and what I chose to create. It was a life of quiet strength, of small joys and steady friendships, of nights lit by a lamp I controlled, and days filled with purpose and peace. The light that once was controlled by an app was now a gentle glow I carried within me, a beacon of the woman I was, and the journey I had taken to find her. If this story finds you at a moment when you feel unseen, unheard, or forgotten, know that you are not alone. The path to reclaiming your own light may be quiet and uncertain, but it is yours to walk. Be your own sign in the silence, your own step away from the shadows. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, holding space for your story, ready to listen, ready to believe in the strength that lies within us all.